Nansen. If anyone can hear, we did something wrong. It's not over yet.
They're not killing us. They change us.
We don't fight back. We adapt.
We thought it was the end.
That was just the beginning.
The war had lasted long enough that no one remembered how it started. It didn't matter anymore. Earth's outer colonies had fallen one by one, entire populations wiped out in the same horrific way, instantaneous biological failure. It was a silent weapon, unseen and unfelt, until it was too late. Surveillance feeds from the attacked colonies all ended the same way. Civilians collapsing mid-step, their bodies rupturing from the inside, flesh sloughing off in unnatural folds. Their bones would break, twisting into alien angles, before they dissolved into nothing but wet pulp. Ships sent to investigate found only empty cities, the walls lined with organic residue, glistening in the artificial light like something had tried to crawl out of their bodies, and failed. The Ishar never left survivors. Not a single life form had ever been recovered from their attacks, until now. The research vessel Nansen hovered in high orbit above Eurydice 4, a fringe colony that should have been wiped out like all the others. But something was wrong. When the military arrived expecting a ghost world, they found people still alive. Terrified, yes. Malnourished and desperate, but alive. The Ishar's weapon, whatever it was, hadn't worked on humans. The footage showed a moment that chilled Dr. Lenora Vasquez more than the deaths of the other colonies. In one clip, a Zark war officer, a species known for their resilience, their thick, armor-plated skin, stood side by side with a human soldier. The Zark collapsed instantly, his body caving in on itself, bones snapping as though something inside him had turned to liquid. The human beside him didn't even flinch. The footage was clear. The Ishar's bioweapon had no effect on humanity. The question was, why? Vasquez watched the screen replay the event again, hands clenched at her sides. Behind her, the sterile hum of Nansen's medical lab buzzed softly, masking the quiet murmurs of her team as they analyzed the survivors. Immunity meant humans were different, and different could be dangerous. "This doesn't make sense," Dr. Arjun Patel muttered, adjusting his tablet as he scanned the latest biological readings. Every species affected follows the same pattern: internal organ breakdown, skeletal liquefaction, neural collapse. But every human tested shows nothing, Vasquez finished for him. Exactly. It's not just immunity. It's like the Ishar's weapon doesn't even register them as a viable target. Patel turned the screen toward her, displaying a magnified image of human cellular structure compared to those of other species. The difference was stark. Where Zark and Ilari cells showed rapid degradation, human cells remained completely unaffected. Not resistant, not damaged, just unchanged. A shiver ran down Vasquez's spine. "We need to figure out why," she said, stepping away from the screen. If they could understand what made humans different, they could weaponize it. The military had already sent orders. Whatever this anomaly was, it had to be studied, controlled, and turned against the Ishar before the creatures developed a countermeasure. Patel hesitated. "Lenora, what if we're looking at this the wrong way?" She frowned. "What do you mean?" He hesitated before answering. "What if we're not immune?" He gestured toward the footage still looping on the screen. "What if the Ishar's attack isn't failing? What if it's just not affecting us yet?" Before she could answer, the lab alarms blared. A voice crackled over the ship-wide comms, laced with urgency. "Security breach on Deck 4. Unauthorized movement detected." Vasquez and Patel exchanged a glance before rushing toward the exit. The research decks were under strict quarantine. Nothing should be moving without clearance. As they reached the corridor, the emergency lights flickered, plunging them into uneven flashes of red. The air had changed, thicker, humid in a way that didn't belong on a controlled vessel. And then Vasquez saw it. A figure staggered at the end of the hall, barely illuminated by the flickering lights. Dr. Hayden, one of the research scientists. But something was wrong. His body moved unnaturally, his limbs twitching in sharp, jerking motions. His head lolled to one side, mouth hanging open like he was trying to form words but had forgotten how. His uniform was torn at the sleeves, and his skin, it was shifting. Not peeling, not melting, moving, like something was crawling just beneath the surface, pressing against his flesh in sick, undulating waves. "Hayden?" Patel called out. The figure twitched violently, his spine arching too far back, his ribs expanding outward as if something inside him was stretching, trying to make room. He turned his head toward them. Not his body, just his head. A slow, grinding motion, his neck bending unnaturally until it was almost completely upside down. His eyes locked onto Vasquez. And despite everything, despite the grotesque movement of his body, he was smiling. Then his lips pulled back further, too far. The skin at the corners of his mouth split, revealing something glistening underneath. Not teeth, something else, something new. Vasquez's breath caught in her throat. The Ishar's weapon hadn't failed. It had changed him, but not all the way. Not like the Zark, not like the others. Because humans weren't like the others. Vasquez barely had time to process the horror before Hayden lurched forward, his arms bending at unnatural angles as he charged toward them. And for the first time in her career, she felt true, animal fear. The Ishar hadn't figured out how to kill humans, but whatever they had done instead, it had only just begun. Dr. Lenora Vasquez stood frozen, heart hammering against her ribs, as the thing that had once been Dr. Hayden lurched toward them. Its limbs jerked violently, like a marionette with its strings half severed. Its face, if it could still be called that, was stretched too wide. The skin at the edges of its mouth split open, revealing glistening raw tissue underneath. It made a sound, not a growl, not a scream. A deep, wet crackling, like the sound of cartilage snapping apart and reforming inside its chest. "Run," Patel whispered. They bolted down the corridor as the lights flickered erratically overhead. Vasquez barely registered the pounding of their footsteps, the way the ship seemed wrong now. Too humid, too warm, like something had infected the air itself. Behind them, Hayden's body twitched violently, his bones audibly grinding against one another. He staggered, then collapsed to his knees with a wet, shuddering gasp. Then he screamed. It wasn't a human scream. It was layered, discordant, as if something inside him was trying to force its way out through his throat. Patel skidded to a stop ahead of her. He's not chasing us. Vasquez turned, breath ragged. Hayden's form was still convulsing, his spine twisting upward, pushing against his skin like something was reshaping him from the inside. His chest bulged outward, ribs expanding like a cage straining against its prisoner. Something was moving underneath his skin. She took a slow step forward. "Doctor? Hayden?" His head snapped up, not turned, snapped. The vertebrae in his neck shifted too far, and yet his eyes were still locked on her. His mouth moved, his teeth fracturing as they widened. And then, in a voice that wasn't his, he croaked, "It's inside." His chest burst open, a wet, sickening pop, followed by the wet slither of something shifting free. Vasquez stumbled back as a mass of translucent, pulsating filaments pushed their way out of Hayden's torso. The strands were thin, vein-like, and moving, coiling, stretching outward as if sensing the air. The edges glistened, wet with his blood, and as the light caught them at the right angle, she saw them contracting. The veins were breathing. Hayden let out a final, choking gasp before his body collapsed into itself. The filaments detached from his flesh, pulling themselves upright, hanging like suspended tendons in the flickering light. And then they moved toward her. She didn't scream. Screaming wouldn't help. Instead, she grabbed Patel's wrist and yanked him backward, sprinting down the corridor toward the medical bay. The thing behind them didn't run. It simply stretched, its filaments growing impossibly long, reaching, grasping. The blast doors slammed shut behind them, and Patel hit the emergency lockdown panel. Vasquez pressed herself against the wall, chest heaving, watching the door. She half expected those filaments to seep through the cracks, slide under the metal like living wires. But they didn't. For a long moment, the only sound was the sharp, erratic beeping of the ship's failing lights. Then, a whispering sound, not words, not voices. A dry, organic rustling, like leaves crackling in the wind. The filaments were moving on the other side of the door. Waiting. Patel was shaking. What the hell was that? Vasquez didn't have an answer. Her brain was still processing what she had just seen. What had come out of Hayden. They weren't immune. They had never been immune. The Ishar's weapon didn't kill them. It changed them. She turned sharply toward the medbay scanner, gripping Patel's arm. "We need to see his DNA structure." Patel nodded, still dazed, and rushed toward the terminal. He pulled up Hayden's biometric records from earlier that day. Healthy, standard human. Then, he pulled up the live scan from his remains outside. The screen flickered. Vasquez's stomach twisted. It wasn't human DNA anymore. Where there should have been the familiar double helix, there was now something else. A structure so fractured and twisted, it barely resembled any known life form. She stared at the shape, feeling her breath slow. It was like someone had taken apart his entire genetic code and tried to put it back together in the wrong order. The proteins were wrong, the sequences incomplete, like something had started writing a new blueprint but hadn't finished it. That's why Hayden hadn't turned fully. His body had fought the transformation, but it hadn't stopped it completely. Her hands clenched into fists. They're trying to reshape us. Patel swallowed hard. But into what? Neither of them had an answer. The whispering sound outside the door had stopped. That should have been a relief. But Vasquez couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was out there was no longer trying to get inside, because it had already figured out another way in. The ship was dying. Vasquez could feel it in the air. Something had changed since Hayden's transformation. The lights flickered erratically, the temperature fluctuated without reason, and the ventilation system carried a thick, organic musk that hadn't been there before. It was subtle, but unmistakable. The smell of decay mixed with something alien, something growing. And the whispers. At first, Vasquez thought it was just her mind playing tricks on her. But Patel had heard them too, thin, rustling noises crawling through the vents, moving just beyond the range of human perception. Waiting. She gripped the handheld scanner tighter as they descended deeper into Nansen's restricted sector. The bone room was off-limits to all but the highest-level personnel. She hadn't even known it existed until the captain had pulled the schematics during their research. It was where the remains of Ishar specimens had been stored, what little they had managed to recover from battlefields before the creatures dissolved themselves into nothingness. Vasquez needed to understand what had happened to Hayden. And to do that, she had to see what the Ishar were made of. The door to the bone room loomed ahead, an unmarked slab of reinforced steel. Patel hesitated beside her, his fingers drumming nervously against his scanner. "Are you sure about this?" he whispered. She wasn't, but she nodded anyway. The biometric scanner flickered as she pressed her palm against it. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a deep, metallic groan, the door slid open. Cold air rushed out. The bone room was unlike anything Vasquez had seen before. The walls were lined with containment units, each housing fragments of something that should not exist. Suspended in cryogenic fields were what remained of the Ishar. Calcified limbs, jagged bone-like structures, and thin filamentous growths preserved mid-motion, as if they had been caught trying to move even after death. The air here was colder, sterile, yet it carried an undercurrent of something old. The kind of wrongness that settled in the gut, primordial and unshakable. Patel stepped toward one of the containment units. "Jesus," he muttered. Inside the glass chamber, a ribcage-like structure was suspended in a pale blue field, but it wasn't made of bone. Not exactly. The material was pitted, hollow, as if it had been grown rather than formed. More disturbingly, it wasn't uniform. Some parts looked human, while others looked wrong, twisted into unnatural curves that served no biological function. Vasquez scanned the structure, watching as the digital readout glitched momentarily, failing to categorize the substance. "Ishar don't leave corpses," she murmured. "They self-destruct. But these were recovered." Patel swallowed. "So whatever killed these ones did it before they could destroy themselves." Vasquez turned to the largest containment unit at the center of the room. Unlike the others, it wasn't a fragment. It was whole, or as whole as something Ishar could be. The preserved torso was stretched and elongated, like a humanoid shape that had been torn apart and then reassembled wrong. Its ribcage was open, and within it, dozens of thin, vein-like tendrils had grown outward, curled and reaching like frozen nerves. But that wasn't what stopped Vasquez in her tracks. It was the structure of the bones. She stepped closer, her breath hitching. Her fingers trembled as she adjusted the scanner, zooming in on the skeletal material. The molecular readout flickered. The scanner struggled to categorize it. The material was Ishar, but the bone structure, it was human. Vasquez staggered back. The realization hit like a punch to the stomach. The Ishar weren't just killing other species, they were incorporating them. This thing, this creature in the containment field, hadn't been born Ishar. It had been turned into one. Patel cursed under his breath. "Lenora, look at this." He had pulled up another scan, one of Hayden's mutated remains, the skeletal restructuring, the tendrils growing from his spine. It was the same. Hayden had been changing into this. Vasquez's breathing turned shallow. The implications were worse than anything she had imagined. The Ishar weren't just an invading force. They weren't just an apex species consuming others. They were a disease, a viral, biological force that rewrote other life forms into itself. But humans were resisting the change. The scanner beeped wildly, the numbers spiking erratically. The preserved Ishar specimen inside the containment field twitched. Patel took a sharp step back. What the hell? The bone structure cracked. Thin fissures spiderwebbed across the surface of the containment glass. Vasquez's mind screamed at her to move, but her body wouldn't obey. She could see the Ishar's ribcage shifting, the tendrils inside reacting. For the first time in history, an Ishar corpse wasn't disintegrating. It was waking up. A new sound filled the room. Not a whisper, not a growl, a resonance, a deep, layered vibration, like something speaking at a frequency too low for human ears to fully comprehend. The sound rumbled in her skull, behind her eyes, sending a cold electric numbness down her spine. Patel's knees buckled, his mouth open in a silent scream. The sound wasn't just noise, it was a command. The ship lurched violently, alarms shrieking as the lights flickered into darkness. The cold containment room was suddenly hot, the air thick with the overwhelming stench of something alive. The whispering noises in the vents grew louder. And this time, Vasquez understood them. They weren't just sounds. They were words. Not ready. Not ready. Not ready. Something slammed against the containment glass. Cracks splintered outward. Vasquez grabbed Patel and ran. The ship was screaming. The walls groaned as if the metal itself was straining under something vast and unseen. The emergency klaxons howled, but beneath them, beneath the failing hum of artificial gravity and flickering lights, Vasquez could hear them. The whispers. No longer just a rustling in the vents, no longer distant. They were here. She and Patel ran through the dimly lit corridor, past bodies that no longer looked human, past panels where the ship's structure had changed, pulsing as though it was growing. The Ishar had infected Nansen, not just its people, but its very matter. The ship was being rewritten, its walls bending, reshaping, adapting. They had minutes, if that, before there was nothing left of the Nansen that was still human. "We have to finish it," Vasquez gasped, her breath ragged. "The experiment, the data." Patel barely kept up, his face pale with shock. "What difference does it make if we don't get off this ship?" "It makes every difference," she snapped, gripping his arm and pulling him forward. "If we die here, fine. But if the military doesn't get this research, humanity dies with us." The bone room had given them the answer. The Ashar weren't just a species. They were a mechanism, a system that overwrote everything in its path. But something about human biology, something deep in their genetic code, was rejecting the process, causing failures. Hayden had almost been rewritten, but he hadn't finished changing. Humans were poison to the Ishar, and Vasquez was going to make sure the whole galaxy knew it. They crashed into the lab, slamming the door behind them. The containment chamber in the center of the room shuddered, the Ishar corpse inside now moving, tendrils pressing against the glass, its fractured, skeletal body trying to reassemble itself. It felt them. She didn't care. She grabbed the genetic sequencer and shoved the blood sample inside. The sample taken from Hayden, still twisted, still unfinished, still human enough to be something the Ishar couldn't fully consume. Patel scrambled to power up the transmission beacon. "Hurry! Hurry! Come on!" The walls of the lab bulged outward, veins of black filaments creeping across the ceiling like spreading roots. The Ishar weren't waiting anymore. They had control of the ship. Vasquez punched in the command. The sequencer flickered, the results pulling together in real time, every scrambled piece of data forming into one horrifying truth. The Ishar had done this before. Not just to humans, not just to the Zark or the Ilari or any of the other species that had disappeared from the galaxy. The Ishar weren't born this way. They had once been something else, something that lost the war against themselves. Patel's voice broke. "Lenora." She knew what he had seen. The data was too clear now. The Ashar weren't an invasion force. They were the last echo of whatever species had created them, a weapon that had consumed its own creators. And now it was trying to consume them too. The containment glass shattered behind them. The Ishar corpse lunged forward, its skeletal frame barely holding itself together, tendrils snapping outward like veins seeking a host. But something was wrong. The thing stopped, its filaments twitching in the air, writhing violently. The sample, the Ishar flesh recoiled from it, curling away, its body shuddering as if it had been poisoned from the inside. That was it. The Ishar couldn't assimilate humans, not fully. Something in their biology was disrupting the process, causing instability, causing collapse. And Vasquez had the proof. She shoved the sequencer's data chip into the transmission port. Every piece of research, every scan, every moment of Hayden's transformation. It all uploaded in a single burst of information, sent screaming into the void of space. Patel let out a ragged laugh, breathless. "It's done. It's sent." Vasquez exhaled, then the walls exploded. The Ishar poured in, no longer whispering, no longer moving like shadowed things in the dark. They were here, their bodies half-formed, half-moving, bones splintering, teeth growing in the wrong places, some still caught in the half-shape of what they had once been. Vasquez knew it was over, But she also knew something else. The Ishar were afraid. They had come to consume the last of the Nansen, to wipe out the anomaly that was human resistance. But they had hesitated, because for the first time in their existence, they had found something that could kill them back. A low, thrumming resonance filled the room, rattling her skull, shaking her bones. A command. The Ishar stopped advancing. They twitched, staggered back, their tendrils snapping and curling inward as if in pain. Vasquez felt it too. Her bones ached. Her spine was shifting. The Ishar weren't just inside Hayden. They weren't just inside the ship. They were inside her. Patel gasped, staring at her. His eyes were wide. She already knew what he saw. The black tendrils under her skin. The way her veins moved on their own. The way her fingers had lengthened, the tips already splitting apart into something almost like filaments. Her body had started adapting, but she wasn't turning into one of them. She was becoming something else, something they feared. The whispers in the air weren't calling for her transformation anymore. They were begging her to stop. Vasquez smiled. For the first time, the Ishar had encountered something they couldn't control. The transmission was out. The military would receive it. The war was already changing. And so was she. The ship buckled, the walls crumbling. The Ishar screamed. Vasquez closed her eyes. She wasn't afraid, because the Ishar weren't the end of humanity. They were just the beginning of something new.